For the past few decades now, theology, the whole field of theology, has stopped, more or less, obsessing with their task of proving God's reality, and has moved increasingly towards stories and poetry that profoundly touch the very depth of human experience. And so, actually, we no longer need to brace ourselves for discussing theology, since the consensus is that God is not knowable. Instead, we find now a movement, and really we're talking 20 years or so, a movement now towards faith and imagination, as demonstrated in Anne Sexton's poem, The Awful Rowing Towards God. Trying to form a relationship with God or understand meaning may still be tenable, but it really boils down to a personal journey with countless surprises. I like the way Bernard Malan frames it. He was a professor. He died not long ago, professor at Chicago School of Divinity. And he says that theology in our modern times speaks of truth as based on the reality that we live more deeply than we think. We live more deeply than we think. And that's precisely why people come through these doors to this church. It finally dawns on them that, yes, they live more deeply than they think. And they need to be fed, need to figure things out, need to put it into a context other than those secular day-to-day routines. And so theology has become a kind of writing. It may be revealed in striking ways like the poem I read earlier this morning, First Lesson, where a father wants to teach his daughter about, what was it about? Trusting the universe. And how to get through those times when fear becomes life-threatening. Another example may be writing about the story of Noah, not as a demonstration of God's wrath and regret, but from the perspective of utter loneliness. The image of a man on a tiny boat on a huge sea. Sometimes I want to be on a tiny boat in a huge sea, not listening to technology. But imagine the image of a man, tiny boat, huge sea, left for 5 months, no horizon, no contact, nothing doing. Such abandonment. And it resonates with periods of our own lives when we have felt so alone, neglected, even abandoned. But hope returns by way of a dove and an olive branch. The perfect illustration of theology's concession that one cannot know the metaphysical, but at best we can only rely on witnesses who have faith, is found in the story we all love, The Wizard of Oz. A terrible twister ripped through the Kansas flatland. As Frank Baum described it, from the north came the low wail of the wind, and suddenly Uncle Henry stood up. "There's a cyclone coming, Em," he called to his wife. Toto jumped out of Dorothy's arms. The house whirled around 2 or 3 times and rose slowly through the air. Dorothy felt as if she were going up in a balloon. A tornado sweeps Dorothy away from Kansas to the land of Oz. And even under the magic spell of Oz, she is convinced there's no place like home. There's no place like home. And the Lion and the Scarecrow and the Tin Man travel with her down the yellow brick road, which she hopes will take her to the wizard and then eventually home. After a terrifying yet exciting adventure in the labyrinth of Oz, her wishes granted, she leaves the colorful world of Oz and returns to the drab tones of her Kansas farm. Auntie Em, Uncle Henry, and the hired help gather around her bed and assure her that she's all right. She has returned back to reality. Oz, they assure her, despite her protests to the contrary, Oz was only a bad dream from a bump on her head. Dorothy protests. It wasn't a dream. It was a place, a truly live place. Doesn't anyone believe me? I don't know about you, but as a youngster, I was very disturbed by the ending of The Wizard of Oz because I believed Dorothy with all my heart. She was a witness to the existence of another world. She saw it. She danced in it, and she sang in it, and she played in it. She experienced it. I know she did. I had complete and utter faith that Oz was as real as Dorothy explained it, her witness to that. But The Wizard of Oz is a story much like the biblical narratives on creation. This may be a surprise to you. It was to me. Salman Rushdie, who is actually no stranger to ideas about home and exile, wrote an essay about The Wizard of Oz. He explains it this way. That's a little dense, but forgive him. We'll get it. The truth is that once we have left our childhood places and started out to make up our own lives, armed only with what we have and what we are, we understand that the real secret of the ruby slippers is not that there's no place like home, but rather that there is no longer any such place as home. Except, of course, for the home we make, or the homes that are made for us in Oz, which is anywhere and everywhere except the place from which we began. So Rushdie reminds us that as the creation writers in Genesis have made painfully clear, that you really can't go back home again to what was. In the creation story, paradise in Eden, we can't go back there. We all now live east of Eden. We've lost the garden. In fact, we got kicked out. And life consists now of the task, the often difficult and brutal task, of creating a home and space for ourselves that can never be ideal. The meaning of what religion calls the fall of man offers a rich texture for understanding the chaos of our lives. Now, a witness proclaiming the actual reality of the garden becomes superfluous, much like Dorothy, whom we want to believe, although we know that Oz is not, cannot be real. But there's so much meaning to be extracted because Dorothy encountered goodness and evil, false gods, wisdom, heart, and courage. Theology melting into poetry, in fact, now is called theopoetics. And it represents nothing new. There's always been tension between the superior wisdom of philosophers and the mundane efforts of poets. Plato, in efforts to create that perfect, ideal society in his Republic, you know what he did? He banished all poets because they were deemed dangerous. What mattered and counted was philosophy, where truth can be reasoned. Poetry is not as clean as philosophy. or theology for that matter. And why? Because poetry embodies passion and desire and threatens the rule of reason. Plato referred to poetry as a deception where real life's purpose is to seek eternal and absolute truth. Poetry challenges the rules of reason by tapping into what he taps into common feelings. And he says poets are always trying to create meaning where philosophers are engaged in eternal truths. Now, I believe life to be too messy and complicated to follow a truth that dwells in the land of abstraction. I embrace truth that stems from real life and even from emotion and my desires and my stumblings. Plato argued that poets manipulate language and care little about accuracy. And yet I turn to poets not for accuracy, but for a creative understanding of how we muddle through life so far removed from that idyllic garden. Of course, the one person who really got it all was Ralph Waldo Emerson. He made it clear that we must, and I love this term, we must work by art, not metaphysics. He nailed it. We have to work by art, not metaphysics. And Emerson, unhappy with philosophers and theologians, declared that one day philosophy would be taught by the poets. I think that day may have arrived. Theology, enveloped in poetics, touches all of us profoundly. It teaches us so many things about ourselves. That's the story of our lives.